Ruthless People movie review. So this is an old movie. This came out in 1986. I was actually a kid at the time, and I vaguely remember some of the buzz around this movie at the time. You know, like some of the commercials, people talking about it. I wasn't allowed to see it at the time, but I remember it, people talking about it. It's not really, people don't really talk about this movie so much anymore. It's largely been forgotten. It turns out, I didn't realize this until recently, but it turns out that this movie was made by what was their name? Abrams Zucker team. And they did the Airplane movies and the Top Secret movies and the Naked Gun movies. So, you know, all of those movies have become classics that have kind of passed the test of time. Whereas Ruthless People, nobody talks about so much anymore. But I was on a Abrams Zucker kick recently, and I was renting a lot of these old movies, Airplane and Top Secret and Naked Gun, and I was watching the DVD commentary to some of them, and they were talking about Ruthless People, which was another movie they did, and I'm like, I remember that from the 80s. I mean, I didn't see it, but I remember people talking about it. I'm like, I didn't know that was one of their movies. So I decided to track it down. And then here I am with my review. So if you read any review of this movie, everyone notes that it's much different than the other Abrams Zucker movies. As Wikipedia puts it, it's a straight comedy bordering on farce, with very few of the innumerable sight gags and puns and jokes of the other movies. So in their other movies like Naked Gun or Airplane, it's just gag after gag after gag after gag. They just see how many gags they can cram into 1 minute. Here, they don't do that. It's more of a traditional comedy, which in some ways is a bit unfortunate, because that cramming as many gags into the scene as possible is what these guys do best. But that's not to say that this movie doesn't have comic potential. A couple of kidnappers try to kidnap and ransom a wife, not knowing that her husband is overjoyed at the fact that she's gone, and her husband was secretly planning on killing her anyways. So the husband is actually only too happy to find out that she's been kidnapped, and he doesn't want to ransom her. Which puts the kidnappers in a very awkward position. Judge Reinhold plays one of the kidnappers, and he does a great job in this. Judge Reinhold was like a big star in the 80s, right? He was in Gremlins, he was in Stripes, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Beverly Hills Cop, and then I'm not quite sure what happened to him. I don't know. He just never seemed to be in any big movies after the 1980s. But he was still famous in the 1980s, and he was in this, and he does a great job as a kidnapper who is completely out of his depth when matched against his ruthless victims. Nobody does the look of comic despair better than Judge Reinhold. There are a few twists and turns that the plot takes along the way, and it was enough to keep my attention. All in all, this movie is no classic. There's probably a reason why it's not talked about as much nowadays as the other Abrams Zucker movies, but I enjoyed it.